the temperature dropped overnight. Not slowly, not gradually. It plunged. By morning, the house was silent. No heat, no water, no power. Ice crept along the windows, and the cold settled in deep into the walls, the floors, the air itself. At first, I thought it was a citywide outage. Then I saw the email. The HOA president had ordered my utilities shut off during an active freeze, claiming it was authorized enforcement for non-compliance. No court order. No emergency notice. Just a decision made while temperatures were falling and safety was at risk. That's when this stopped being an HOA dispute. Because cutting off utilities in freezing conditions isn't enforcement. It's a crime. And the city didn't take it lightly. Winter had already been rough that year. Temperatures had been dropping earlier than usual, and the city had issued multiple cold weather advisories warning residents to protect pipes, keep heat running, and check on vulnerable neighbors. Everyone knew what a freeze could do to a house if utilities failed, even briefly. My home was prepared. The heat was on. The water was steady. Everything was functioning the way it should. The compliance issue with the HOA had been ongoing for weeks, but it wasn't urgent. It wasn't structural. It wasn't a safety hazard. It was one of those vague rule interpretations that lived in gray territory, something the HOA president insisted needed correction, even though it had existed long before she took office. Emails had become more frequent. Deadlines appeared without explanation. Language grew sharper. Authority was asserted without proof. I responded calmly. I asked for clarification. I asked what rules specifically applied and what legal authority allowed enforcement. The answers were always short and confident, but never detailed. What made me uneasy wasn't the issue itself. It was the timing. The cold snap was approaching fast. Weather alerts were everywhere. Pipes were at risk. Heating systems were critical. And still, the HOA president continued pushing compliance as if none of that mattered. I checked my utility accounts again. All services were in my name. All bills were paid. There were no shared meters. No HOA authority. No city notices. There was no legal path, none, for the HOA to interfere with essential services. Not under normal circumstances, and certainly not during a freeze. That's why I dismissed the final message she sent late one evening. She wrote that enforcement would proceed as authorized, and that delays would have consequences. It sounded dramatic, but vague, like so many HOA threats that never amount to anything. I went to bed believing the worst outcome would be another fine or another notice. I had no idea that by morning, the temperature would drop below freezing, and the house would be left defenseless against it. Because this time, enforcement wasn't coming in the form of paperwork. It was coming in the cold. The cold woke me before the alarm did. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was wrong. The kind of cold that doesn't belong inside a house. The air felt heavy and sharp, like it had settled in overnight and refused to leave. The thermostat was dark. No heat. I tried the lights. Nothing. I turned on the faucet in the kitchen, then the bathroom. The pipes groaned, then produced nothing more than a weak sputter before stopping completely. That's when the fear set in. Pipes don't wait politely during freezes. They burst quietly. They rupture behind walls. They destroy a home long before you realize what's happening. Every minute without heat mattered. I checked my phone. No outage alerts. No emergency notifications. No citywide shutdown. Then I saw the email. It had been sent just after midnight. The HOA president wrote that enforcement had been authorized due to continued non-compliance and that utilities had been temporarily suspended until corrective action was taken. She framed it as an administrative step. Routine. Necessary. There was no mention of the freeze. No acknowledgement of danger. Just pressure. I called the utility provider immediately. After a long hold, a representative confirmed what I feared. There was no city-ordered shutoff. No safety issue. No non-payment. But there had been a request. Someone identifying herself as an HOA official had contacted a contractor, claiming emergency authority and citing compliance enforcement. The request bypassed normal safeguards, but in the chaos of winter demand, it had gone through far enough to disrupt service. That shouldn't have been possible, but it was. By mid-morning, the house was already losing the fight. Cabinets grew cold to the touch. The floors felt like stone. I opened every sink slightly, hoping to keep water moving, but there was nothing to move. I layered up and began documenting everything. Photos of the thermostat. Videos of dead faucets. Screenshots of the HOA emails. Weather alerts showing the temperature drop. Then another message arrived from the HOA president. She reminded me that compliance would resolve the situation. She suggested that restoration was within my control. She implied that the discomfort was temporary and avoidable. That message crossed a line. It confirmed intent. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't poor judgment. It was leverage. I forwarded everything to the city's utility department and emergency services line. Within minutes, the tone of the conversation shifted. This was no longer a customer service issue. This was a safety violation. A city supervisor called me back personally. He asked about the temperature inside the home. He asked how long services had been off. He asked whether anyone else was affected. When I told him it was just my house, his voice tightened. By early afternoon, the temperature outside continued to fall, and inside, the silence grew heavier. Every creak of the house sounded like a warning. Every minute without heat increased the risk of permanent damage. And somewhere, an HOA president believed this was an acceptable way to enforce a rule. What she didn't understand yet was that freezing conditions change everything. Because once utilities are shut off during a freeze, enforcement becomes endangerment. And that's when the city stops asking questions and starts taking action. The city arrived faster than I expected. 2 vehicles pulled up just as dusk began to settle in. A utilities supervisor, a city inspector, and a fire department official stepped out together. Not to investigate later. Not to schedule anything. To intervene. They walked through the house immediately. No small talk. No hesitation. They checked the thermostat. They opened cabinets. They tested pipes. One of them knelt near an exterior wall and pressed a hand against it, shaking his head slowly. The temperature inside was already approaching the danger zone. They didn't ask whether the HOA had permission. They already knew the answer. Within minutes, emergency restoration was ordered. Not through normal scheduling. Through override. Trucks were dispatched. Service points were accessed directly. Heat and water were restored under city authority, with technicians working in freezing conditions to prevent further damage. As the house began to warm, the city officials stayed. They printed the emails. They photographed the shutoff points. They documented the timestamps. They compared them against weather alerts and city freeze advisories. The pattern was unmistakable. The HOA president had ordered utilities shut off during an active freeze, with full knowledge of the conditions, and had continued pressuring compliance while the house was at risk. That night, the city contacted her directly. The conversation was brief. She was informed that HOAs have zero authority to interfere with essential utilities, that misrepresenting enforcement as an emergency is a serious offense, and that doing so during freezing conditions escalates the situation from civil overreach to endangerment. By morning, the response was no longer administrative. It was legal. The city filed formal charges related to unauthorized utility interference, misrepresentation to service contractors, and creating hazardous living conditions during a declared freeze advisory. These weren't warnings. They weren't internal penalties. They were citations backed by statute. A cease and desist order followed immediately, barring the HOA from any interaction with utilities, access points, or contractors. Management companies were notified. Vendors were warned. The HOA's authority was effectively cut off overnight. At the next HOA meeting, the president didn't sit at the head of the table. She didn't speak. She barely looked up. Because when enforcement crosses into physical danger, power collapses fast. And the law doesn't negotiate with people who turn heat into leverage during a freeze. After the city finished its work, the house slowly returned to normal. The heat stabilized. The water ran freely again. The pipes held. A written notice arrived confirming that the restoration had been ordered under emergency authority and that no HOA had any legal right to interfere with essential services, especially during declared freezing conditions. The documentation was explicit, clear, final. The charges against the HOA president moved forward quietly. There were no public statements, no dramatic announcements, just official filings and deadlines that couldn't be ignored. The city made it clear that the case wasn't about a compliance dispute, it was about safety, misrepresentation, and endangerment. Within weeks, the HOA leadership changed. The president stepped down without explanation. The board issued a brief message about restructuring enforcement procedures and reviewing past actions. The compliance issue that had triggered everything was removed from the records entirely. Neighbors started asking questions. Some admitted they'd received similar threats in the past, never acted on, but unsettling all the same. Others said they'd assumed the HOA had more authority than it actually did. What happened changed that perception. People began asking for proof, for documentation, for limits. As for me, the experience left a lasting impression. HOAs are meant to manage communities, not to gamble with people's safety. And when enforcement turns into coercion, especially in dangerous conditions, it stops being an internal matter. Because cutting off utilities during a freeze isn't just reckless. It's unlawful. And that line, once crossed, can't be explained away with rules, emails, or authority titles. Some boundaries exist for a reason, and in the cold, those boundaries become impossible to ignore.